We never expect, much less want, to find ourselves caught up in abusive relationships or toxic dynamics, such as trauma bonding or gaslighting. In fact, traumatic bonding, which involves abusive power and control, coupled with cycles of intermittent reward and punishment, can create or worsen serious mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. Sadly, many of those affected, largely women, become stuck in abusive relationships due to many issues, including low self-worth, shame, and deep fears of stigmatization. Today, we're joined by trauma expert and former wife of the Wolf of Wall Street, Dr. Nadine Macaluso, who will be sharing her expertise on abusive relationships and emotionally manipulative behavior. Today, we'll focus on this listener's real-life question. I'm a smart, successful woman and never thought I'd be reaching out for support about abuse. Everyone thinks I've got a great life, but I'm embarrassed to confess that my partner of 5 years has gotten really abusive. I feel stupid because I didn't see it at first, but now I can't ignore it. Everyone loves him because he's charming, but he's toxic behind closed doors. If people knew, it would affect both of our careers and our friendships. Can you help me? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Marie Manley, and this is Imperfect Love.
Welcome to Imperfect Love with Dr. Carla Marie Manley, psychologist, author, and relationship expert. I'm here to help unravel mysteries and misconceptions about love, relationships, and mental health issues, plus everything in between. Love is complicated, people are not perfect, and relationships surely can be tough. Together, we'll navigate this messy, imperfect space of real life.
Please note, as this episode contains sensitive information, listener discretion is advised. If you need support, please see the special links in the show notes. Today, I am joined by a fabulous special guest, Dr. Nadine Macaluso, who will share her expertise on abusive relationships, trauma, and emotionally manipulative behavior. Dr. Nadine is the author of the book Run Like Hell, a therapist's guide to recognizing, escaping, and healing from trauma bonds. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Nadine. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you. And before we launch into today's very poignant question, could you tell our listeners just a little bit about what makes you, you?
Sure. What makes me me is that I am obsessed with love. And I'm obsessed with healthy love, unhealthy love, imperfect love, just love of all types between lovers, between parents and children, because I just believe that life is all about connection and that's what makes life worth living. So that's why I've made it my life's mission to understand it in the way that I have come to understand it.
Thank you so much for that very precious introduction. And you and I are definitely aligned in that respect, that there is something about love. Without love, what do we really have in life? And yet there are all forms of love, some types of so-called love that pose as love that aren't love, but we're told they're love. So we have lots to talk about today. So let's first look at the listener's question. What do you make of that? And we can really get into dissecting it and using it as a platform to help that individual, but also help all of our listeners understand what traumatic bonding is, what abusive relationships look like, because many times people are in relationships and they don't realize they're abusive. Or like our dear listener, which is not an uncommon concern that I get, somebody gets into a relationship and whether it's weeks, months, years, after the wedding ring's on, whenever it is, the abuser either doesn't show their behavior early enough,
Right.
or the other individual, the partner doesn't realize that it's abuse even when it is, and they don't see the red flags, or a combination of both. So, your thoughts on the question of the day?
The question of the day is the whole reason why I wrote my book. Because what had happened when I first opened up my private practice, I was really not specializing in anything. I wanted to treat anxiety, depression, personality disorders, mood disorders, do couples work. But what was happening was that all these smart, kind, beautiful, amazing women were coming into my office trauma bonded, right? And just as the listener's question states, that they're confused, though. They don't know that they're trauma bonded, really. They have a feeling about it, but since it's not physical abuse and it's more coercive control and psychological manipulation, they know something's wrong, but they can't put their finger on it. And they feel so ashamed and they feel embarrassed and they don't want to share it with their friends. And hence, that is why they come to therapy, or they came to therapy and they still continue to come to me, because something's wrong, but I don't know exactly what it is. And I'm ashamed because I think I should have known better.
Thank you for starting the interview with such eloquence on that topic, because you captured what the question of the day calls embarrassment. And indeed, it may be embarrassment, but you're getting to that important piece of shame, because shame is set. Embarrassment, hey, I tripped, I have a spot on my dress and I'm out in public. That tends to be
Right.
embarrassment. I made a social error. But shame is, as you know, I am bad. I am not worthy. I made bad decisions. There is something wrong with me. So thank you for pointing that out. And it's a perfect way to start looking at this, that's what often the abuser does.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Right. Because as the listener stated, she's a high functioning person. How is this happening to her? And it's even more confusing when the other partner, the perpetrator, is charming. And everybody thinks that the partner's fabulous. But meanwhile, as she states, behind closed doors, she's getting emotionally abused, probably coercively controlled, manipulated. And so, in that, um, you can feel very alone in that.
Absolutely, because I think that is a big part of the perpetrator's goal, is
Yes.
to foster a sense of isolation by taking away friends, by pushing people out. If there are family members, creating rifts with family members, so that that person who is being coercively controlled is more and more alone. And then that sets up the stage, that sets the stage for those little doses of positive reinforcement, those little I love yous, or a present or a trip or whatever it is, that keeps the person engaged, because then it makes them second guess, well, he can't be all bad
Right.
because he is giving me all of these little things. So I must be focusing on the negative. And in fact, the perpetrator will often bring that out and say, well, everybody at work loves me. All my employees love
That's
me.
right.
All my coworkers love
That's
me.
right.
All my golf buddies love me. So it's got to be you, because everyone in the external world loves me. Well, why wouldn't they? Because that individual, generally a he, research shows us that most
Good.
perpetrators are male, but we know that abuse can occur in any kind of relationship. It occurs across all genders, all types of relationships, but we do see a lot of male to female where there is that perpetrator is the male. Would you agree?
Yes, yes. I mean, that's what the research shows. That's what actually enters into my clinical room more. And yes, of course, I acknowledge that it can cross all genders, all different sort of sexual orientations, right? But no, it usually is male to female. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because we do live in a patriarchy. And a lot of times, this pathological lover, as I like to call them, feels entitled. And that can happen a lot in the patriarchy because it's about a hierarchy. And so a lot of times these pathological lovers feel entitled, they feel superior, and they lack a moral compass. And that's a lot of times what's perpetuating this very toxic behavior towards somebody they supposedly love.
I love how you put love in air quotes because in my fourth book, I talk about pseudo love, where people love, and I would imagine you agree with this because we're very aligned here. Love is action. So if we say to someone, I love you, yet we are verbally or physically or spiritually or financially abusing them, we are not loving them. Love is an action word. And so if we love someone, we are doing things that help them be their best selves. We are supporting them. We are holding them accountable if we need to. We are engaging in healthy conversation. Yet so much in our society, in many societies, passes as love when it is actually abuse. If the other person is saying, ow, this hurts me, that sarcastic comment doesn't feel good. You making fun of the size of my, rear end, or you making fun of my work product, or you attacking me for my cooking not being perfect, or you constantly working to erode my sense of self-efficacy. That is all emotional abuse.
Yes, it
So
is. It is emotional abuse.
let me ask you a few questions just to help make sure our listeners have some of the terminology and also to flesh out some of the key concepts you're already throwing out. You talk about the entitled individual who feels superior and who doesn't have a moral compass, or at least a properly developed moral compass. We do live in a world where there's a lot of patriarchy, a lot of misogyny.
Yes.
What would you encourage individuals, regardless of gender, to be on the lookout for, whether they're dating, whether they're already in a romantic relationship? What are some of those key red flags so that with our listeners' question, or anyone, and there are many, many people out there where this listener's question will resonate, what are some of the red flags when you talk about that sense of entitlement?
Yeah. So when you're in this sort of relationship, you're not allowed to have boundaries, right? So you will see that a pathological lover will plow through your boundaries because it's all about what they want. And another sign is that you can't have any needs because it's always about them. And as time goes on, what you'll notice is that words don't match actions. And they say they're going to do something, but then they never actually show up and do it. And if you go on a first date and you get on that date and that person says all their exes are crazy, there might be a reason why all their exes are crazy. Might be because they made them crazy.
I agree. And sometimes it's the way of maybe the exes were saying,
Right.
and the exes were saying, wait a second, there's something wrong here. You are abusive, you are negative, you are sarcastic, you are critical. And of course, this very me-oriented individual is going to say, well, you're the problem, and projects all of that individual's issues and says they're all crazy, when in fact, I imagine if you got those women in a room, not that they'd all be perfect, mind you, because none of us are perfect, but they might have some common agreements about how that individual was very abusive. So you talk about boundaries, you talk about that me orientation, you talk about you're not able to have any needs, and the words don't match the actions. I agree with all of those. So let's take those and just really look at them. I'm a big fan of boundaries, but many of the people, as in my practice, as probably in yours, we can't have boundaries if we didn't grow up with boundaries because we don't know what boundaries are. Or we might have overly rigid boundaries or overly porous boundaries. Could you talk a little bit about what healthy boundaries look like?
Yeah. And, healthy boundaries are about, understanding, first of all, what do you need? What are your values? And being able to connect to your authentic self and then being able to express that to a person in a very serious way, right? Like, this is what I will accept. This is what I won't accept. This is a deal breaker. And then holding that boundary, like holding it not against them, but you're just saying and you're enforcing your own boundary. And in a trauma bond, it's really difficult to do that because this person will use, harm, exploit, and betray anyone to get their needs met for money, power, pleasure, and status. So, what you need, what you value, what you want cannot interfere with what they need.
Very well put. And I think that this takes us both how we can prevent, you know, ourselves from getting into these relationships, but also how if you're in one, how you can baby step your way toward finding yourself again, because that's what happens in
Right.
these trauma bonded relationships, sometimes called traumatic bonding, where you lose that sense of self,
Yeah.
which is what the abuser wants. They want you off kilter. They want you second guessing yourself. So it's how can I, if I, the listener, wants to stay in the relationship, what can she start doing? And I love how you're talking about boundaries because it's that diving inward to see what are my values?
Yes.
What are my needs? And then starting to voice those.
I think it's really important when you're in this sort of relationship, you're so focused on the other because you have to be, right? So if you want to stay in the relationship and try to hold your sense of self, it's very important that you turn the mirror back towards yourself and stay interested in you and do things outside the relationship to keep your confidence up, whether it's working, whether it's having a hobby, whether it's making your own money, because you often have to forfeit yourself to keep the couple's identity. But if you can foster confidence or relationships or work outside of the relationship, that also will keep you tethered to yourself. Because often they say, quit your job, don't worry about it, right? Or don't see that friend, or you don't, do you really need to go sing in choir? Like, so they're often trying to block you from living in the real world without them. And that's something that you have to do to maintain a sense of self within the relationship.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that you brought that up to put on our to-do list for all of our listeners. That if you are choosing to stay in that relationship, whether permanently or temporarily, realize that I love how you use the word tether. Tether yourself, which the abuser may not like, in fact, probably will not like. Keep your friends. Don't let the friends be, and it might mean that you go visit the friends instead of bringing the friends home. Keep
Yeah.
your family members. Again, it might meaning going solo to see the family members. Keep your hobbies. If you've lost your hobbies, find your hobbies.
Yeah.
Do your walks, do your hikes, do your painting class, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So find ways to tether yourself outside the relationship. And I really appreciate how you brought the part up about you forfeit yourself to have the identity of the relationship. And that's part of the cure here is to find the self again if you lost that self. And it sounds very much like the listeners like, wait, we look really great. This is great couple on the outside, but what can I do? And part of that is what you're saying is find yourself, find your identity again and focus on you. And it's interesting because part of the trauma response is that hyper focus on the other,
Mm-hmm.
partly because you're afraid of the other. So you're having to constantly monitor the other for the next lie, for the next manipulation, for the next time the rug is pulled out from under you. So
Correct.
part of it is necessary. But the other part that you're saying is let that radar go ahead. You can have that radar. It's serving you. But also really start finding yourself again in that way where you're not constantly in that fearful place within that relationship.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Perfectly, perfectly. Yeah, because, you do walk on eggshells, right? When you're living like that, and a lot of times due to fear, because they can be very dominating and threatening and intimidating.
They absolutely can. And what's really interesting is I've noticed that sometimes the abusers will turn on their partner and say, "You're not walking on eggshells. I'm the one who's walking
Yeah.
on eggshells around you." So
Yes.
they do the gaslighting that
Yeah.
makes it so confusing for the individual, which is the nature of gaslighting. It makes the individual feel as if their perceptions are completely inaccurate.
Yes. Yes, and that's another great, sign to see if you're with a pathological person. They will always be the victim.
Yes, they always make it about them.
Yeah, everybody's always hurting them, everything's always happening to them, even though they're perpetrating abuse towards you, right? Like you say, they turn it, "You're the one that's doing that to me." And then you're like, "What? Wait, am I?" No. But they victim signal. There's a term for it. It's called victim signaling. And they do it not just to their lover, but to everybody, because that also preys on our empathy. And if we're an empathetic person, they got us hooked.
Yes, and what's interesting is I've noticed that many of them don't even need to do it in the outside world because they are putting out that charismatic self.
Yeah.
So they're really, and so all of that tends to get projected. A lot of that negativity tends to get projected behind closed doors because they're so busy putting on the nice
Yeah, yeah,
guy
yeah, yeah, yeah.
to
That's
the
true.
external world.
That's true too.
So let's just go back for a minute to boundaries and looking at finding that sense of self again so that you can create those boundaries and notice and say, wait a second, I'm happy to make dinner, or I'm happy to do this with you or that with you, but I have my boundaries here. I am not willing to do this. I am not going to do that. I am not going to accept being treated like this. So boundaries and that can be pretty scary when there's an abusive person on the other side. But learning to practice those boundaries, even if you're practicing them with friends, maybe if you can find a trusted friend or a therapist where you can let them know what's going on and start practicing standing up for the self again, which
Mhm.
for a woman who's strong, right, who finds herself strong in the workforce, like our listener here, or strong in the external world, that might be really hard. It sounds like it's really hard for the individual who wrote in to say, gosh, I've lost this inner strength and now it's just a puppet show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be hard, but you know what? Also, I always say, like, look for the helpers, like Mr. Rogers told us. Some people are too young to know who he is, but um, you'd be surprised, once you start to talk about it with a friend or somebody at work or a relative, you will see how many people are actually experiencing similar things, and to share in a way that you feel comfortable so you don't feel, or a therapist, of course, so you don't feel so isolated. And since they are gaslighting you and wiping out your perspective, it's good to talk to someone to regain perspective, because then you start to just see it through their lens.
Absolutely. And that's a part that is so helpful that I've seen in women's support groups or domestic violence support groups,
Yes.
where you're looking at a room of women, or again, it's across all genders. You're looking at a room of people and you're seeing across all walks of life, doctors, attorneys, firefighters, stay at home moms, artists,
Right.
cashiers, across all sectors.
Mhm.
There are women who have found themselves in abusive relationships. It doesn't make any one of them bad or stupid or
No.
incompetent. It makes them women who were either programmed from early childhood forward to fall in love, to find abusers normal, right? To find that behavior acceptable, or people who fell in love with someone who is so good at being charismatic, so good at being manipulative, that they don't show it. They can carry that on just like they do in the work world for years at a time until it doesn't serve them. And that's why often, I don't know about in your practice, but in mine, I found that once a wedding ring is on, or once somebody has moved in, once they've gotten, as you said earlier, they'll do whatever they need to get their needs met. And if their
Right.
need is to have someone on their arm to go on trips with, or to do the housework, or just to make the house not feel
Mhm.
so lonely, whatever it is, or
Right.
somebody just to beat up on, they
Right.
will keep that pretty smiling face on or that handsome smiling face until they get what they want. And then all bets are off. Is that
Mm.
your experience?
Yes, it's totally my experience, unfortunately. And that's, you bring up a good point in that it's everyone and anyone. And that's another reason to not feel so much shame and embarrassment because abuse is always the fault of the abuser. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book was because I was so sick of all the victim and the stigma around the victim. Instead of saying, why does she stay? Well, why do they do that? Right?
Even when you say that, not much in life makes me get pretty angry, but that does make me angry.
Mm.
That statement that people will make that, oh, it's your fault for staying, or it's not the abuser's fault, it's your fault for staying, or how did you get into that? Or for the abuser to say, you picked me, what's
Right.
wrong with you? All of
Exactly.
those things. And I think, wait a second, in a world where we all know that love works,
Mhm.
love breeds love. Love breeds good health, physically, mentally. There is no excuse,
Right.
none, for
Yes.
anyone to be abusive. We're in a world, maybe, pre-internet, maybe there wasn't enough information to know, but I'm almost saying that tongue in cheek because we always know. We know innately when we are harming someone, when somebody's crying and or looking at us with such pain in their eyes, we know when we're causing harm. So
Right.
there is, I agree with you and I echo the abuse is always the fault of the abuser and never the fault of the abused. Never, never, never. Now, the
Right.
abused may need help in gaining reality and getting resources. And there are times where people stay in abusive situations because, again, they're afraid of being a failure to their friends, their family. They're afraid of their career being harmed. They're afraid that they don't have anywhere to go. They might
Right.
not have the money ready to go get
Right.
an apartment. They might be afraid of losing, all sorts of things because society will stigmatize someone who stands up and says,
That's
I'm
right.
in an abusive relationship. Please help me get out.
That's right. And also, earlier when you mentioned the intermittent reinforcement, right? So, what I say is that hope is the hook because 70% of the time they're cruel, controlling, abusive, but 30% of the time they're caring, generous, and helpful. So, that 30% of the time really keeps the person so hopeful. Like maybe they'll go back to the beginning, maybe they'll be nice again. And so they just keep hoping for that to happen. And that intermittent reinforcement causes so much confusion.
Absolutely. And that's a piece that people might not realize. I'll pause there for a minute. Intermittent reinforcement listeners is why gambling at in casinos is so addictive because you don't know when you're going to get the payoff, right?
Right.
So researchers have long known it's why, you get your paycheck once a week if you're employed or once every other week. It's reinforcement on a schedule. You know when it's coming. Intermittent reinforcement, which is unscheduled reinforcement. You never know. You don't know when those flowers are going to arrive, or you don't know when the hug is coming, or you don't know when that surprise, honey, let me make you a nice dinner, or honey, oh my God, you're the best ever in the world. I just love you so much. And that's what keeps you staying. Not because you're broken, not because you're stupid, but because you're human and you're imperfect And you, like every other human on the planet, know on some level can get hooked into reinforcement because it works.
It works. It works. And it's not a cycle of abuse like people talk about. It really is. You never know when the abuse is coming. You never know when the kindness is coming. You never know when the abuse is coming. And it just keeps you stuck in the middle. And it really keeps you trapped. And that's the glue of the trauma bond.
And it sounds so, for someone who's never experienced it or worked with it might sound so unbelievable because you might be like, oh, well, then just leave.
Right.
Right? Because the person has abused you once, so just leave. But what you're talking about is the hook of hope. That is so natural and so atavistic because as humans, we have to be wired for hope. We
Right.
think of our ancestors and they're out looking for food. They have to be, or berries or a place to sleep. We are wired to be able to deal with periods where we have adverse circumstances. And
Yeah.
then, but we go forward, we move forward because of hope, because we know we will find those berry bushes. We know we will find that stream that has some fish in it. We know we will find that shelter. And I mean, that's my own theory on it, looking at it historically, evolutionarily, that
Mhm.
we do get hooked in because we're wired to get hooked in.
Yes. And then you combine that with love and a family and finances and extended family being close and holidays if they're married, there's so many different layers to it. And so now we see why it's so hard for somebody to extract themselves from it. But yet it can be done.
It absolutely can be done. And just a piece back to supportive friends, supportive, trusted family. And I will emphasize the word trust, reaching out to people that you know who can trust you rather than turn on you, because that only worsens everything that's going on underneath on a mental health and negative physical health level. But a support group, there are many free support groups across the nation, around the world, for women who are experiencing abuse. And as you said from the beginning, we tend to think of abuse as being physical abuse, but as many, many, many people who have been in abusive relationships will say, the abuse, never saying that physical abuse is okay or it's not hurtful, but that the emotional abuse can be so much more difficult because you don't have that black and blue mark to show the doctor or the best friend. And so, and the family members seeing Mr. or Ms. Nice Guy all the time. And so when you are showing up and saying, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, I'm hurting, he's awful to me, you are even afraid to voice it because everybody thinks that, oh, it's just emotion. Oh, yeah, I hear him being sarcastic with you or negative, but just toughen up,
Right.
which,
Right. Or it takes two to tango. It's your part in it. Right. And again, like you said, not that we all don't have things that we need to look at. And of course, none of us are perfect. But when one person is the dominant, intimidating perpetrator in a relationship, they have all the power. And
yes. And that takes us to the piece you were talking about, the entitlement. Because in our society, men still, no matter how hardworking women are, men still have so much of the power, so much of the financial resources that it is, and even if financial resources aren't an issue, which they are for many, 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 many people, it is really hard to leave that relative safety, emphasizing relative safety because it's what you know.
right.
And that's what, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know.
Yeah.
That external world, which now feels so unsafe because you're afraid again of the stigma. You might have financial concerns. You might be afraid that people will look at you and say, well, it must have been you've got to be the problem, or people where your career might have negative impact from all
Sure.
sorts of reasons, that it can be really hard for anyone. And I'm emphasizing that because research shows us that 1 in 3 people, every third person who crosses your path on the street who every third person you count or three people you count in the grocery store, shopping mall, wherever you are, one of those three is a victim of some form of emotional abuse.
Unbelievable,
And
isn't it?
that's what's reported, right? That's the
Right, that's
people.
what's reported,
Yeah.
right.
And those are the people who are not calling in or who look and say, oh, well, it's okay. He's just being funny. Or the people who are still believing that they're too soft skinned, that they're not tough enough, that it's their problem. But if you really start looking at those reported statistics, we know that what's reported is there's often a whole lot more, just like domestic violence, it's 1 in 4. And that's what's reported. So we know that in our world, which can be very aggressive, very violent, and where men still are able to get away with far too much under the guise of, it was just a joke, or you didn't say no loudly enough, right? All of those things. Or, hey, you're staying, I have the money, but you can leave. And the other person saying, what do I do? What do I go live on the street? So leaving that for a minute or maybe for a while, you talked about the me orientation. And without getting into saying that everybody who's abusive is narcissistic or is diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder,
Right,
we
right.
don't have to go there because narcissism occurs on a continuum,
That's
right?
right.
And way at the one end is NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. But from what I'm hearing you say with the me orientation, which is one of our red flags, would you say that there's a pretty strong thread of narcissism in the individuals who you see are the perpetrators?
Yes, I would say that there's definitely a thread of narcissism, but I am similar. I have that pet peeve of everybody throwing around the word narcissism. And I use the term pathological lover because I believe that anybody that will use and exploit and harm the person that they love is pathological, because pathological simply means mentally unwell. And this person, yeah, they are very selfish. Often they are very self-absorbed, but also a narcissistic personality disorder is a cluster B, right? And so they're very dramatic and erratic, those personality disorders, because they might have a little mix of antisocial personality, a little mix of borderline. And so that's why relationships with them, aside from them being self-absorbed, feel dramatic and erratic. And yeah, but the person usually has a lot more going on than just narcissism. They can have substance addiction, right? They can have compulsive process disorders like gambling and sex. They're highly impulsive. They can have a mood disorder. They can have some psychopathy mixed in there. So that's another reason why it's very hard to figure them out, because they're often very complicated people.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think it's just going straight to NPD for a minute,
Yeah.
narcissistic personality disorder or bipolar. Many clinicians really steer clear of both of those disorders
Yeah.
because they are so complex, right? You're working sometimes with it feels like 10 people in the room at once
Right.
rather than
Right.
one individual who has some issues to work with. And that's the really interesting part. They can be highly successful in the external world,
Yeah.
highly, highly successful. Yet on that inside, there are so many pieces. And that's why I really appreciate you saying, well, it could be some of this, it could be some of this, it could be some borderline, it could be some mood disorders. And you captured it very well in the erratic and the dramatic. And the dramatic is often what makes them charismatic to the external world because they can be very funny, they can be very light, they can be very articulate when they're talking their talk. But it's
Yeah.
the erratic piece that sometimes shows in the external world, but very much in the internal world. And they also, as part of that erraticness, they have two sets of standards, right? One standard for you
Yes. Yes.
and one standard for them.
Yes. 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 And I'll never forget, I read Lindy Bancroft's book, Why Does He Do That? And when he said double standards are abusive, I was like, that's it. That's why double standards bug me, because they're abusive. And that was just such an eye-opening moment for me. I'll never forget that. And I wanted to mention one more thing too that they have. They're very Machiavellian. They're very manipulative.
Yes.
And so, and I want to share this with the listeners, in that when women are trying, or anybody's trying to leave the trauma bond, I say to them, unfortunately, the kind part was often manipulative. So they think they're dealing with two people, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But when they really realize that it was all a manipulation for the pathological person to get what they wanted, it starts to dissolve the confusion a bit.
Yes. And thank you for highlighting that, because I agree. Often, especially in the love bombing phase of the relationship, or getting somebody into the relationship, once all of that kindness that you think is that individual through and through. It's like, well, he was so kind and he was so sweet and he did this with me and he did that with me. And all of that, when they later realize, oh, wait a second, that wasn't true kindness. That was part of the ploy. It was
Yeah.
part of the game. It was part of the manipulation, which is why when it gets into the relationship, they let little pieces of that kindness
Right.
show up
Right.
as a reminder to the individual. See, nice guy's
Mhm.
still here. Nice person's still here, which
Right.
again keeps the person very confused about their own footing. And listeners, you may be thinking, well, is there any hope for this relationship? And I do want to just pause and say, and then get your opinion, Dr. Nadine, that I have seen in rare cases that when both people are really willing to work on themselves, where each partner says, I really want to be a better person. I really want to grow in this relationship. And when there is that meeting of minds to grow and evolve out of these toxic dynamics, I have seen amazing change happen. But if even one of those people, generally the perpetrator, says, no, I see nothing wrong with me. It is all you. It will always be you. Major red flag, listener. The person who does not want to grow and change, because as looking at love as the foundation, if you're with someone who doesn't want to grow and change and continue to evolve toward their best selves, which is all of us, right? We all have that opportunity. Then that might be the major red flag that you would want to look for is the person willing to go to therapy with me? Are they willing to truly invest in creating healthy habits? Is that your experience?
Yes, that's my experience too. I mean, all over the internet, you'll see they'll never change. They'll never change. I don't believe that. I think you and I are in the business of change, right? We support people through change. And I have seen that if the pathological partner really wants to change, now they have to want it. I've seen them change.
And I don't know about you, but for me, from my lens, it is some of the most gratifying work.
Oh, it's the best. It's the best. And yeah, and again, it's not that often, but it really is possible. And, sometimes they will go to therapy as a trick, as another manipulation. So you got to watch out for that. But if you're with a good clinician, usually they can suss that out. And if they say, hey, I want to change, I see that I have some of this behavior, that behavior, then that's great. Because that helps the whole world. One of those people's change at a time.
Absolutely. And thank you for pointing that out, the piece about the short-term therapy as just a trick to get somebody to stay or get them off track. That is an important piece, because often, I see this with couples, often when divorce is imminent and the abused individual says, I want a divorce, or I want out of here. And the perpetrator will say, okay, fine, I'll go to counseling, after the person's been asking for it for 5
Right.
years or 10 years. And they use it only to get the person back in and then they drop out. Whereas for this kind of personality issues and mental health issues that are going on behind the scenes, for these dramatic types of issues, these really invasive patterns, often what's needed is couples therapy and individual therapy.
That's right.
Individual therapy for the abused person, sometimes group therapy is enough, depending upon the individual, and marriage therapy, relationship therapy with somebody who is really good at it and practiced at it, because those abusers can pack a powerful punch, I'll tell you. And then for the abuser, the perpetrator, often therapy oriented toward emotional intelligence, toward trauma therapy that often underlies some of these patterns, actually for both partners, therapy to work with anger issues, all of these things. And I love looking at therapy. I don't know about you, but as an opportunity, so many people, particularly the perpetrators and often men, see therapy as a burden, like, oh, it's something I have to do, something I'm being forced to do. But when we realize that therapy, it's why I do what I do. It is an opportunity for us to change intergenerational patterns of violence or any negative intergenerational pattern that we inherited. We didn't say we wanted it. We didn't even know about it. And here it's come down and we're acting it out, not knowing perhaps on our children, our friends, certainly our intimate, relationships. And so I see therapy as such a gift to get rid of patterns. Where else in life, even in the business world, do we want to have patterns where we're throwing money away on practices that don't work, where we're losing, you think of all the retail, are they going to get rid of negative practices so they can thrive? Of course they are. Why wouldn't we want to give that same gift to ourselves?
I mean, that's the truth. That's the truth. And I love that how you say that because, when we do experience developmental trauma as a child, we don't have a choice. But as an adult, we do have a choice. And that's the beautiful part, that we can go to therapy and, don't carry the transgenerational trauma. And, I had my daughter over. She just turned 31 with her baby, and she's a therapist. And just to see how beautiful her family is, right? And just to see the impact of me being in therapy for 25 years and being a therapist. It's like, okay, we did it. We did it.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things is when you look and say, the work I did, I'm so proud of that work. And I do have to say, for the abusers, one of the reasons I just get so excited when somebody starts transforming out of those patterns is that individual, regardless of gender, is now a role model in more ways than they realize. They are out there when they're treating their partner with with respect. People are paying attention. When they're treating that partner with disrespect, people are paying attention. Wherever you walk on this planet, people are paying attention. And when we are treating people with kindness and love and respect, we are just in those actions. We are changing the external world because there are kiddos and teenagers and other wives and other husbands and parents saying, oh, that's how you treat someone. They may not know that behind the closed doors of their home. They may see abuse. So we're changing it in the external world, but we're also changing it because when we're kind to each other behind closed doors, when we walk our talk of being good, charismatic indoors and out, outside, right? Whatever that means to us, then we're changing the relationship within the self, and we're changing that partner's or the children's experience of love, which means we've created a home where there is a safe and healthy way of being. And that just goes, like you said with your daughter, it grows exponentially because then the kiddos are growing up with a foundation of love rather than a foundation of trauma. I mean, genuine love, not this false love, this, oh, I gave you everything. I gave you this, I gave you that, but I gave you abuse, right? I gave you all of this, the education, I gave you the money, I gave you this, but I abused you. That is not love. That is, listeners, I work with so many people who say, oh, but my parents gave me education and they gave me a start and they gave me food, clothing, and shelter. And I say, yeah, so does Alcatraz. That was Alcatraz gave food, clothing, shelter. That was their tagline, right? That doesn't mean they loved you.
I love that. That's
I
so,
know. Isn't that frightening? When
it's
we
right.
think of it, and that's what some people look back at their childhood, go, I got food, clothing, shelter. Like, okay, well, welcome to Alcatraz. It does not mean you are loved. To love somebody is to see them, to attune to them, to take time for them, to hold them accountable. And to me, that is a huge part of love and being in a loving relationship, which is why the perpetrator, as you get stronger, going back to our listener's question for the day, part of you showing that partner love, if you do love them, is holding them responsible,
That's right.
saying, wait a minute,
Yep.
yes, do not let them, if you see them gaslighting you, doesn't mean you engage with them. Don't battle. Don't go down that road. Just like, wait, this is my truth. I'm walking away now. I'm taking a time out, doing things like that, right? What do you think,
Correct.
Dr. Nadine?
Correct. When my patients want to stay, I say you have to name what's happening to you. If your partner's being emotionally abusive, you have to say you're being emotionally abusive. You need to stop. You're being verbally abusive. I'm not going to tolerate it. You just name it and you'll be shocked. They kind of stop instead of saying, don't do this. This hurts me. Boom.
And what happens, because I've seen this one where they say, I'm not being abusive. They
Yeah.
start the gaslighting.
Yeah, they
You're
start.
the abusive one.
And then that's where you just say, okay, you're gaslighting me. I'm leaving, right? You name it again. You name it to tame it. And that is one of the things that I have seen work.
Love it. Love it. So listeners, that might seem very subtle, but notice what Dr. Nadine did right there. You don't engage when if you say, hey, you're being abusive, and they say, no, I'm not, it's you. Say, okay, you're gaslighting me. No, I'm not, you're gaslighting me. And you can go down that rabbit hole for hours, right? And instead, you simply say, this is not going anywhere. I see you are continuing to gaslight me. I'm going to take a time out. You go ahead and gaslight. This is one of my favorite things to tell people. Tell them to go ahead and gaslight the mirror that you're going to go and take a time out. You want to go and gaslight someone, go gaslight the mirror. I'm going to go and take a time out. And that way you're not engaging, because manipulative people, abusive people, they get so much joy. It's so strange. They get so much enjoyment out of creating the trauma, out of being abusive, out of seeing that fear and that horror or that sadness in somebody else's eyes, likely because that was what was done to them, but it's not an excuse to be doing it now.
That's correct.
Okay, so two more things that you had brought up that I really want to make sure we cover before we end. You said that when you are with this type of individual, that you can't have any needs. And I'm grateful that you pointed that out, because I often think of this type of individual as wanting basically a robot in their home.
Yeah.
A Stepford wife, where they want you there to be the pretty face or to cook or to clean or just to take away the silence that they don't like. But when it comes to your needs, saying, I would like this, they'd just rather you go in a closet and be quiet, oh, just look pretty, just shut up and look pretty kind of thing. Instead of saying, wait, this is a human being who I've asked to be part of my life. And even though I'm 100%, this is the abuser, I'm 100% I oriented and everything's about what I need. Wait, here's a person who is a human being who has a 50% say in, or 100% say, right? However you look at it, because if each person has 100% say, you can have that and then collaborate and compromise to find a middle ground. But that abusive person doesn't even want you to have 50% say. They just want you to shut up. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's two things going on there. First of all, they don't really value emotions that much. They don't really live unless it's their own emotions, but they don't really value emotions like the way you and I do. And the second thing is they don't really have empathy or compassion. They're really missing that chip. So when you have a need, it's like their heart doesn't wake up and doesn't want to lean in and take care of you, because they really don't have empathy. And they're just like, okay, whatever, but this is what I want. So this is what we're doing.
You put it so beautifully how there is that lack of empathy and the piece about waking up the heart. That is so important because when they're in that constant I state, I want, it's about me, there is that lack of empathy and the heart is dead, which is what it's, if you
Right.
can have any empathy for this type of individual, it is that part that says, oh my God, you're missing out on so much of life because your heart is not awake.
That's right. That's right. There's no heartfulness. We talk a lot about mindfulness, but there's no heartfulness there.
Yeah. And that's one of the downsides, just using the term narcissism for a moment, and we look at the etymology of that word, it does come from, the Greek tale of looking in that pond. Narcissus looked and looked and fell in love with himself and to his own demise ultimately, because there's nothing there but your own reflection. The
Right.
heart was not awakened, the sense of anything outside the self. And it may feel good on one level to get everything you want and do everything you want and whatever, but you're missing 99% of life because your heart, it's all about you. And when it's all about you, you're missing, by definition, everything else and everyone else because you only want them if they're serving a need, which brings it back to being all about you. So thank you for that piece. Now, words not matching the actions. We've talked about that in bits and pieces throughout our discussion, but I'm hearing you say that for this type of individual, the abuser, they will say, I will do this for you. Come in, move in with me. We'll have this beautiful life together. Or come in and we'll raise your children, as part of my own. Or come on, don't worry. You don't have to work a day in your life yet. Then they end up tricking you into this or that. All of these ways they can tell you you're going to be safe, give up your, apartment and everything and just come and live with me and you'll be safe, whatever it is, give up your job, whatever. But it is always about catching or capturing something by having a mismatch between words and what they will ultimately deliver. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think you use a really important word there. You use safe. And I think if we were just going to like encompass it in one thing, it's that they promise you safety and you get exactly the opposite.
So beautifully said, Dr. Nadine, and so poignant because that is the truth of it.
Yeah, that
And
really.
oh my goodness, and listeners, that is what we are wired to want and to need. You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Safety, security, that's down on the bottom. If we do not have safety and security in our relationships, in our home, so to speak, then we cannot perpetuate that safety and security in the self because you're constantly on edge. And that's not your fault. If somebody promises you safety and you believe them, it is not your fault that you believe them. It is their problem for having been so thoughtless and so manipulative as to make a promise they had no intention of keeping. Oh my goodness, Dr. Nadine, you have so much to offer. I think we have covered quite a lot of it, but not all of it. Let's just wrap it up with how this is all perceived by the individual as traumatic.
Yeah, well, the thing is that trauma is anything that really overwhelms our ability to cope, or it's anything that's outside the realm of normalcy. And so this traumatic bonding is definitely not a normal relationship. And it definitely does overwhelm us and we don't know how to cope. And that's why we feel like we're in a fog. And hence it feels very traumatic.
Absolutely. And we don't know the listener's background, but if that listener came into the equation with any pre-existing trauma, this will have necessarily exacerbated that trauma. It will have intensified. So whether that individual was abused as a child, went through trauma at work, any form of trauma in life, any romantic trauma in the past, whatever it is, this will have compounded that, not because it is the victim's fault, but because that victim was coming into the relationship hoping and praying for safety, because that's what was promised. If the individual came into the relationship securely attached, no trauma in their past, this will have given them an experience of incredible trauma that may take, this is the really very sad part, regardless of the situation, how the individual experiences that trauma is, depends on person to person, right? We're all different. We will all experience it differently, process it differently, and need different forms of therapy or assistance to get out of it. It can take years and years to heal from an abusive relationship.
It can. And that is the hard part, because people want it to be over quickly. But the good news is recovery is possible.
Recovery is possible. And the beautiful piece is that it is possible for both, or one of the beautiful pieces, for the victim and the perpetrator. And that when we really start talking about issues like this, no shame, no blame, but simply saying to the perpetrator, wait a second, you're being less than you could be. You are not be. And, this needs to change. This needs to change. And by being part of that change, we can all make the world a healthier and safer and better place.
Yes, we can.
Dr. Nadine, you are fascinating, and it's such a joy to have shared time with you. Where can our listeners find you?
Sure. They can go to my website, drnae.com, and I have tons of resources and assessments on there. And they can find me on Instagram at The Real Dr. Nadine.
So listeners, look for all of this in the show notes, including a link to Dr. Nadine's wonderful book. And I'm going to spell her name for you. It's Dr. Nadine, Nadine, Macaluso, Macaluso. Dr. Nadine, thanks again. It has been a joy and a privilege.
Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for sharing this journey with us today. As always, it is a joy and an honor. And this is Imperfect Love.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. Remember, you have the power to transform your life and love fearlessly, if imperfectly, and it's my privilege to help you along the way. You can find more life-changing content, including my books and other podcast episodes, at drcarlamanley.com. Feel free to submit your own confidential questions through my website. I'll do my very best to include your issue on a future episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Until we connect again, this is Dr. Carla Marie Manley wishing you oceans of blessings and love. Please note, this podcast is psychoeducational in nature and is not intended to replace formal mental health support. Please contact your healthcare provider or emergency hotline if you need psychiatric care. And as always, please take good care of your amazing, wonderful self.